we were just talking about Mr. Hightower and your dancing with him. You'd done your first thing together out in L.A. You did the short. Did you do any movie acting as well at that time before going to New York? Did you?
Yeah, I did. I had an agent, the same one that Lana Turner had. His name was Henry Wilson, and he was actually in the Zeppo Marx office. And he's the one who shortened my name, well, because he changed everybody's name. Rock Hudson was somebody else. I mean, Troy Donahue was somebody else. But he felt that Belcher was not the happiest of choices for a young actress, dancer, whatever. So we just cut off the last syllable, and I became Marjorie Bell. I was never very lucky with it. I mean, I was in 5 shows in New York, and I did several small things. And the very first picture that I can remember being in was with Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. I mean, Fred wasn't there that day because it was a shot of Ginger seeing. He was playing Mr. Castle from the Castles, and she was in a box with 3 of her friends, seeing him on stage for the first time. Irene Castle, she was playing, and I sat just behind her. So that was a little. It was only 1 or 2 days' work, but it gave me a feeling that I would really like to do movies. After all, I was a Hollywood brat, and I had to live up to that name. So I did that. I did something with Veronica Lake. I don't even remember the name of that one. And then I did a little film called Sorority House. I did a few things. They were, it wasn't what you'd call an astounding career or that anybody was knocking the doors down. But just enough so that I knew that that's what I wanted to do. But what I really wanted to do was go to New York and be in New York shows. Because to me, that was going to the place where it all begins. And I'd also sort of dreamed as a younger person of being a radio, a rockette at Radio City until I found out that they had to do 5 shows a day. And it was really back-breaking work. And I wasn't tall enough. I mean, nowhere, not even for ballet, was I really tall enough or built for ballet, and which is what I had really trained for all my life. I was 5'2", and I have, instead of a short waist and long legs, I had shorter legs. Fortunately, they were slender, so they didn't look as short as they were, and a long torso. And even in those days, you had to have, your only place, your only refuge place was in musical comedy, because there were no standards about whether you had to. Also, you could be funny, you could be a soubrette, you could be a leading lady, you could be a romantic lead, you could do all sorts of things in musical comedy, and you could sing. And I started taking singing lessons shortly after I got to New York also. And I was in 5 shows. None of them were terribly successful. One of them has become a classic, Dark of the Moon, which I played the Fair Witch, from Snow White to the Fair Witch. That ran much longer than it should have on Broadway, simply because the Schuberts who produced the show, they wanted to keep the theater. And not until they found somebody who would pay them to get out of the theater did we close. We dropped down, after about the 2nd month, we dropped down to maybe quarter houses or half houses. And it did become a classic. It's been played in every high school and community theater in this country. but and it got very good reviews. It didn't seem to catch on in 1945. It was just about the end of the war, or our participation in it, and for whatever reasons, it got very good reviews, and nobody cared. That happens, you know. Mm-hmm. It's not only that the New York Times can break a show, they can't even make it a hit, even if they like it. And Brooks Atkinson liked it very much in those days.
So but you arrived in New York in '39.
Yeah.
What was it like? Describe New York at that time.
Well, it was, you know, like you've seen in lots of movies. Certainly it was my dream place. And I inhabited the West Side always, because that's where the dancing schools were. That's where I would run around with all the other young people to the drugstore and find out what shows were auditioning. And I auditioned many, many times for many shows. I was lucky enough to get into a few of them. But it was, you could walk through Central Park at night without fear of being. There were things about New York that are very similar to what they are now. But there were also things, or maybe I was just 19 or 20 and had stars in my eyes. But I felt it was a very friendly place. I was this real greenhorn from California, and there was always the disparity between California-born and bred actors, dancers, whatever you wanted, singers, and although it's amazing as I look back on it now how many dancers came from a state where everybody thought you did nothing but go out on the surf on those big boards, you know. It's amazing. Martha Graham, Agnes DeMille got all her training there. Miss Ruth, Ruth St. Dennis, some of the best women choreographers for the modern field, some of the best dancers, Maria Tallchief, Gwen Verdon, all of us grew up in California. And yet, if you went to class in New York, you know, you were really considered, you better start working out twice as hard as anybody, because New York was the place to be trained.
Did many of you, the people that you went to school with in the West, did they try to migrate east as well to make it on Broadway?
Not many. Well, not many even went into show business. I still, once in a while, go and visit. Hollywood High still has a group that sort of started with the graduating group of 36 and now has incorporated into this 3 times a year. They have a luncheon. It's not an alumni society, but there are still about 100 people that show up, 110 people that show up. And I would say 9/10 of them have stayed in California, and a huge percentage of them married their high school sweethearts.
Because good girls didn't.
No, they did not. And so they've all been married over 60 years.
Wow. When you were in New York, did you take acting lessons?
Yes. I studied acting. I studied dancing. When I first got there, I couldn't afford to do all of the studying because I was really on my own, and I was trying to, declare freedom. And freedom, along with freedom goes poverty. I found that out very quickly. But I did study with Chester Hale, who is a well-known choreographer as well as a dancing teacher. I studied with, this was dancing. I studied voice as much as I could. I had studied in California for a year with Maria Uspenskaya, who was a great Russian actress who taught the Stanislavski method long before the studio was born. And so I'd had some acting. I didn't really get situated in what I felt was truly studying acting until after I stopped dancing, which was when I was 40.
Yeah.
And then I studied for 2 years with Sandy Meisner. And that's when I realized that my next time around I'm going to be an actress. It's a longer career. Either that or a singer. But I did participate in as many things as I could get invited to. And it was mostly dancing because I felt that was my chance to get into Broadway shows. And it really was. I was in a show called What's Up that George Balanchine did the choreography for. Because in those days he would do the dances for anything that paid money. It didn't matter whether it was a Hollywood movie or a Broadway show or what it was. That was not a successful show. It was the first Lerner and Lowe show. And it's one that even Alan Lerner forgot that he had done. But we did play for about 3 months at the theater where Rent is playing now, just below 42nd Street. And I did some regional work. I went to Detroit and played in. I went out to the Paper Mill Playhouse and did one of Marilyn Miller's old shows called Sally, and that's where I met Richard Rodgers. He came out to view the show, not because of me, but because of the girl who was playing. Billy Worth was her name. And she was playing the soubrette lead. And she had been in a couple of Rodgers and Hammerstein shows. And they were friends. But he saw me and he said that he came into my dressing room and said that he thought that I would really be Rodgers and Hammerstein material if I would take some really study voice. He said I needed work on my voice, which I knew because I really was tone deaf. And so he recommended a teacher, and I studied with her for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and every so often Mr. Rodgers would come down to the St. James Theater in the afternoon or sometime and hear me sing again and see whether the progress I was making. I never got into a Rodgers and Hammerstein show, but it's interesting because Gower worked with him on a show which he eventually also did not do the dances on, but he worked with him we became friends. And I would say that Richard Rodgers was one of a really sort of mentor situation for me, at least with my voice. It so happened that I auditioned, I don't know, maybe 7, 10 times for Carousel, because I was right, he felt, for the role of Carrie Snow. And my very last audition at the St. James Theater, it was on a Monday morning, and I remember him coming down the aisle. The whole theater guild was there, Amina Marshall, all these people were there, and they had said, okay, she's Carrie Snow. And just as that happened, Mr. Hammerstein came. I saw him. He was a very tall man, and he came down the aisle. I could see him. I was standing on the stage. I'd finished my last song, and they had a quick little interview. I mean, they talked to each other in the aisle there, and Dick Rodgers came back down, and he said, I want you to come to the office this afternoon. I owe you an explanation. I said, I'm not going to get the part. He said, I owe you an explanation. Come this afternoon. So I knew even though he had said I had it, that I didn't have it. I went to the office, and over the weekend, Mr. Hammerstein had written in the opening of Carousel, there are all these waltzes. And he had written lyrics to all the waltzes, and they were to introduce all the characters in some sort of form that Agnes DeMille was going to magically put together. So he explained to me that until that time, everything that Carrie had to do was within my voice range. But I was not a soprano, and he had written lyrics that fell in the soprano range for the carousel waltzes. So I didn't get the part. Somebody named Jean Darling got the part. And when they opened in, it was either New Haven or Hartford, they sang those lyrics one night, and then they eliminated the songs. But by then I was used to show business. And it also enabled me very shortly after that to, when Gower got out of service, even though he didn't want to be part of a dance team, he really wanted to be on Broadway without having to audition. He hated auditioning. I'd gotten used to it. And so we put together the act at that time, really so that people would come and see us at the Persian Room or somewhere and then think that they had to have us in their New York show. Never worked, but we had a good career anyway.
The Carousel, what year was that?
Carousel, I think, was about, it was the next show after Oklahoma. So I think it was probably you're asking?
Early 40s?
Yeah, it was early 40s. I can't remember the exact year.
And the war was on at that point? For Americans' involvement?
I think, isn't that terrible? I think it was just over.
Oh, okay.
I think it was just over. Maybe it still was. It's somewhere. If you give me a chance to look it up, I'd look it up. 43, 40. Okay. No, 43. I did the show with George Balanchine, and it was during the war, and it was about the war. It was a silly show, but it was about the war, and so it must have been 44,
right around there.
45.
Okay. Well, during the war, how did that affect you? What was going on in New York at the time?
Well, it only affected me in the way that we did a lot of benefits for the boys. I went to the canteen 2 or 3 nights a week and danced with the servicemen. My war career was not distinguished, but I did what I could, and. I never felt that being a nurse or anything was my thing, and I never got invited to do any of the USO shows. So I did whatever came up. It was mostly entertaining, writing letters.
So after World War II, Gower came back. How did you team? Because I know you were a little reluctant too, weren't you, to have a dance part?
It seemed to me that it wouldn't be a bad idea. Also, he came back to New York in, I think it was 45. What was I in? I was in Dark of the Moon when he came back the first time. And then he went out to Hollywood again and got a contract with MGM, which lasted about a year. He danced Smoke Gets in Your Eyes with Sid Charisse and a movie called Till the Clouds Rolled By. But by that time, the war was over, and he had been in service for about 3.5 years, but he was mustered out earlier than, let's say, Gene Kelly was then available again and things like that. So he wasn't getting the first choice parts. And so then he came back to New York again and had decided that he was going to try for New York. And but he really didn't like to audition. So we started putting the act together.
Did your father have any input in?
Oh yes. My father had written me the minute he came back from service and said, "Boy is back in town and he's studying." Yes, he kept me up on it, and I wrote to him. That's the reason why he came back to New York before he had that contract with the MGM, and that's when our romance sort of started to begin. There was no thought of teaming up. We just had a good time together. We had so much in common, besides dancing, cats, artichokes.
So how did you finally team? Did you dance together, practicing?
Yeah, we went to class together. We went to Hanyu Home, had a class for ballet dancers who wanted to learn modern, and we went to class together. It was a very short period. It was only a period of a couple of months, but it was our let's keep it gay period. We weren't going to get serious about anything, just have fun. But it became a little more than that. And then he went back to California, so I didn't see him for a while. I went off and did Sally again in Louisville, and I did, I could do jobs by that time. And second time he came back when he had done with MGM. That's when I was in a show called Beggar's Holiday, which was the first integrated show on Broadway. It was the Duke Ellington version of Three Penny Opera, and it starred Alfred Drake and Zero Mostel. And when we originally went out, a woman named Libby Holman, who was very well known in New York. And it also had a totally integrated cast. Avon Long, Marie Bryant, Mildred Smith, and a score by Duke Ellington and John Latouche lyrics. And I was in that show, and Dancing with Paul Godkin was a very strange hybrid show, but one that I remember with great affection. But that's when our serious romance became. And Paul had asked me to get together a few numbers and that we could double into the Waldorf for the late show there. And I told Gower about it, and he said, well, if you're going to dance with anybody, you're going to dance with me. And that was the first time he had ever mentioned anything. But that's the way he was. Also, I was a little bit chunky at that time. And he brought his manager around to see me in the show. And I remember hearing later that Lou had said, oh, you're going to dance with that fat little girl in Beggar's Holiday. So, of course, the minute we teamed up, I had to start dieting, which I did for the next 13 or 14 years. Because he could eat anything, and he was very, very slight. And if I had any weight, I just am not a slight person.
So what were some of the first things that you were doing practicing together? Did you?
Well, he rented a room in Greenwich Village, and we rehearsed every day for about 2 months while I was still in the show. And then we borrowed $30 to get up to Montreal because he had booked us. In April of that year, he had booked us into one of his former spots that he and Jean had played very successfully.
Was he choreographing all of your dances?
Everything. And I would have input, but he really, well, I had never worked in a nightclub. I didn't even know what a supper club was. The first time we appeared at the Normandy Roof in Montreal, which is where we broke in, I was trying to go off into the wings, and of course there were no wings. I mean, we had come in through the way you do in a supper club. You come in from where the maitre d' stands to the ballroom part of the stage. Nobody sees you from here down because, especially if you're short, they're all sitting there, and the sight lines aren't very good. But I had no idea of what it was to work in and to do 2 shows a night. And fortunately, he was so schooled in that and had been so successful that he was able to guide me through it. But he kept saying, where are you going? And I said, off stage. And he said, it's this way.
Did you have chemistry immediately?
Yeah, we must have, because the reviews instantly were just astounding. And we went from there to the Bradford Roof in Boston, and then from there to St. Louis, because I had gotten us booked in St. Louis at the Muni Opera, we did a show there, the first show of the season, which was written by an Englishman named Ivor Novello. And he was very famous during the war. He was kind of the working man's Noel Coward. And he played Hansel and I played Greta in this show. And so we did that, and then we were booked into supper club at the Park Plaza in St. Louis. And then right to Chicago to the Empire Room at the Senior Moment. We're losing that one.
Park Plaza?
No, that was Park Plaza
Yeah.
in St. Louis. It was in Chicago. We were there for 13 weeks with Liberace. And then we got married.
That was in 47?
That was 47.
So describe your relationship as dancers. What did each of you bring into this team?
Into the team?
Yeah.
Well, Gower brought the conceptions, and that's his strongest point always was being able to visualize, the visualization, the conception. He had a limited vocabulary in dancing, but he also had an extraordinary way of being able to tell a story through dance. He was self-made in so many ways. He had learned in those, 6-7 years that he danced with Jean, how to handle, he was very musical. He learned how to handle the lighting situations, as difficult and as sparse as they were in supper clubs. He learned how to deal with orchestras and orchestra leaders, because we couldn't yet afford to take our own. The first thing that we invested in after we had was a conductor, arranger, who went with us and who knew how to conduct whatever orchestra you were given. And if we needed extra pieces, then we paid for them. So the first 2 or 3 years, we really put everything we earned back into the act. But he brought all that knowledge with him. And I think I brought an ability to connect with an audience. I love performing. And he really loved rehearsing, so that he would quickly tire of doing it night after night. But I never did, because I always found something new in it. I gave myself that goal.
Good place to stop.